Hey, I hope you've had another great day today. I was talking to one of my students at school, and he's like, so did you always want to be a pastor? I'm like, no, absolutely not. That's a hard no. And he's like, well, what? Well, I mean, what did you do? And I said, well, I went to college and I initially wanted to help people, so I was going to major in sociology, and then I took some soc classes, and I was like, it's the most boring stuff I've ever heard in my life. So I got into radio, and I worked at a radio station, and then I started working at a school for court adjudicated delinquent boys, and really liked working with youth, and then started working with a youth group at my old church, and he's like, wait, what? How, how did that prepare you to become a pastor? And I'm like, hey, I have no idea, other than the fact that as I was doing all of these things, I learned how to speak in public. I learned how to work with youth. I learned how to present myself in a way that people could relate to. I don't blow smoke, right? When somebody asks me a question, I tell them the truth. I try to do it in love, but I try to tell truth all the time. And so he starts like, well, how do you become a pastor? And so I told him, I said, my old pastor asked me if I wanted to become a pastor. I told her she must be drunk. And he's like, what? You can say that to a pastor? I'm like, dude, some of the things I've heard, it'll turn your hair gray, right? Okay, so I'm like, yeah. And she like said, hey, man, you need to do this because this is something that I see in you. And he's like, well, I kind of I can see you being a pastor. I'm like, that's a good thing because I am one, you know? And here's the thing. People see things in us that we don't see in ourselves. Sometimes someone can come up to you and say, hey, you know what, man? I think you really would be good working with children. And you're like, you are crazy. I don't even like kids. Or, hey, I think maybe you would be wonderful working with teenagers. You have a caring, merciful spirit about you. And you might think, are you crazy? Those kids, they're kooks. Or, hey, you know what? You ought to get involved in ministering to prisoners. You have this way about you, and you don't see any of this stuff, but others see it in us. So as we go through our lives, we need to be aware that just because we don't see ourselves in a certain way doesn't mean that God isn't preparing us for that next step, for that next opening, for that next ministry. That somebody comes to us and says, hey, you know what I see in you? We need to hear with God's ears, see with God's eyes, and feel with his heart. Because sometimes our own emotions and our own wants and needs get in the way of what God truly intends for us in our lives. Listen to the voices that come into your life and maybe chase after them, as they can be God's voice in another person. May God continue to pour out his grace, mercy, and blessings on each and every one of us until we get to meet again. Amen. Amen.